When I was preparing this talk, one of the things that I kept in mind was the question, what are the key ideas we can learn from Confucius that are relevant for our situation today? Truth is, in reality, many, if not all, are relevant, but one in particular seemed quite important for today, namely the concept of ethics and interconnection with others and the surrounding world. For Confucius, the happiness of the human being is rooted in our experience of unity, which naturally leads him to give a great significance to our relationships with others and nature. And during this lockdown, what we all probably saw in a new light, how essential our relationships with our environment are to us. What Confucius didn't seek, he didn't seek superficial relationships, but the ones that are built on a strong foundation of mutual understanding, individual responsibility, honesty, social solidarity, and human dignity. And what he proposed was a path of human values, which are universal, meaning that they are valid for you and I, that helps an individual, a human being, to educate oneself in becoming a Junzi, or a gentleman, as it is commonly translated. A different way to explain this concept that Confucius gives to us is to become a noble individual. So it is that type of education in ethics that leads to the nobility of the soul. Now, you may probably think there is nothing new to this. And what we see throughout the history in all schools of antiquity, what they proposed is a philosophical path of bettering ourselves. And we all know that to live this in the face of our predicaments is not that simple. The same thought we find in our Western tradition, what Plato describes in the concept of an awakened individual who is capable of harmonizing or bringing into harmony a head, heart, and hands, so that there is no discrepancy between our ideals and actions. As a school of philosophy in a classical tradition, what Monica explained a little bit earlier, we, New Acropolis, look at history in order to discover a silver lining of these timeless ideals so we can learn from humanity. For instance, how did they assert the best of themselves and the values that inspired them to do so? Not as accumulation of dry facts that are relevant to our daily living, but to learn from human experiences that gave inspiration in their pursuit of wisdom and therefore happiness. Our general tendency is to approach life from a critical point of view. It's how we are thought to think. So where we often find ourselves is that we criticize history and focus on the negativity of the past times. Perhaps sometimes due to search for entertainment, or a little of drama or sensationalism, but this is not necessarily always a useful approach if we want to learn and better ourselves. Perhaps there is also an element that by highlighting the negativity of the times, we excuse all the problems of our times. So basically we can justify that these are necessary to human life and human condition without any questioning. Why? So that we can continue living as we do. Even if deep down we know that accepting a different point of view, a different vision of the world, we would need to have an inner change of the individual if we are to make a world change. And so Confucius was not different in his pursuit of wisdom and self-mastery. He recognized that a just society, motivated by solidarity, starts with a just individual. And he was an example of that. He, as a human being, as a person, was very humble. He always highlighted that he learned from the great masters of wisdom, and he never really claimed to be wise himself. Although in the end, what we're going to see, he created a great impact on the Eastern tradition, and more we start seeing his teaching coming into the Western thought. What he said and the way he described himself, he always described himself as a lover of the ancients, without crediting himself with wisdom, but rather as he saw himself as continuing the work of the great masters of wisdom. And so Confucius brings us to this concept of ancestors, which in reality highlights a deep human sentiment of origin, recognition that we have a tradition of values to share together, and that we are all a part of one humanity. What is quite remarkable when we start discovering Confucius is that there was nothing otherworldly about him. He had the life of you and I, which makes him quite relatable to us. His example, seemingly small at the beginning, will impact us so much today that he's considered to be the mentor and model of 10,000 generations. His philosophy of life, which later became his teachings, became his legacy by the power of his example and clarity of their ideas. Now, even today, 2,500 years after his death, we continue to connect with his teachings. And this great philosopher was in many ways a genius of his time. And why is this important to us? Because these teachings bring us in touch with our consciousness and the profound questions that every human being has, namely, who am I, where do we come from, and where are we going? And in moments of crisis, these are essential questions, you may think, because why? Because they give us a framework on how to face the crisis in front of us. These questions also may be uncomfortable because they bring us in front of the unknown, lack of answers, limits of our self-knowledge, and in front of our own ignorance. But also they bring us in touch with mystery, the mystery of ourselves, but as well the mystery of life that we yet have to conquer. And so being afraid to question ourselves will make us confuse our inner crisis with external, blaming our outer predicaments for the lack of happiness, while in reality, the state of our happiness doesn't depend on anything external, but in knowing and mastering ourselves. Something similar we find, or something like that we find in this Greek concept of virtue. They call it pteros, if I pronounce it well, which meant the wings of our soul, that which gives the wings to our soul. And Confucius transmits that concept a little bit differently. He talks about the ritual propriety. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this word correctly. So when was Confucius born? In the year 551 BC, in a state of Lu, which was a vassal state of ancient China. And to give you some geographical idea where this lies, it is north of today's Wuhan, which is one of the provinces that unfortunately we know better than the others. Or you can also imagine it is between Beijing and Shanghai, you know, somewhere in the middle. And to place him in time, this was about 80 years before Socrates, or 120 years before Plato. So, just to give us an idea. He was born in a family that was not wealthy. So his father was a mid-level soldier who died when Confucius was at about 3 years of age. His young mother will raise the child, and Confucius will always have a great respect for her. So what this meant is that being of a humble origin, Confucius had to accomplish himself in many arts and crafts. And some of those are archery, logistics organization, charioteer, debater, a hunter, a musician, in order to make a living. And very early in his life, he will discover his love for learning, so much so that there are anecdotes that come from later in his life that say that he was so enthusiastic about learning that he forgot to eat and that he is growing old. But what type of learning? Well, it wasn't intellectual learning per se, rather related to the ancient wisdom that teaches human beings in knowing how to be and unites them with the laws of life. Because professional skills that he had to acquire for him were nothing more than necessity to earn the money and earn the living. But in reality, what he pursued his whole life was to philosophize or to become a builder of oneself and liberator of man. Now you may ask, of what? Well, of our own ignorance. And so what he brings to us is that external accomplishments don't lead to happiness, which is quite contrary to what we hear today. But what leads to happiness is accomplishing ourselves in being a noble individual. And again, this brings us back to this concept of Junzi, or a gentleman, or a noble individual. What Confucius will do is he will his whole life pursue a political career, but not for his own personal ambitions or out of desire for recognition, no, rather as an opportunity to apply the timeless ideals in collective living. And so this brings us to the concept of politics that in our world today is something that is often understood in negative terms. And so we can take a look how ancient Greeks understood politics. It is rooted in the word polis, which means city. So philosophically, in a philosophical meaning, it is related to being a citizen, and therefore to our civic responsibility towards others. And here I'm adding towards others, regardless of who they are. Mm-hmm. And so all these considerations that we can see and say are universal, we find in the Confucian philosophy, which for him was an art of living and not intellectualizing life, but an effort to practice ourselves in virtue, loyalty, friendship, truth, but as well building a good government. And all of these brought meaning to human existence. Throughout his life, he will get an opportunity to apply these philosophical ideas in practice, in running the state. So although he was never really, he never reached a high position in politics, he did get a chance to become a local mayor, which was offered to him by Duke Ding in the state of Lu. And he was so successful that he was fairly quickly promoted to a minister of justice and later to a prime minister. And during this time, when Confucius was in these positions, Lu became a model state. What Lu was in particularly known is that loyalty, trust, and benevolence became a standard in the state. However, this won't last because Confucius at some stage is going to get in conflict or at odds with the Duke, who wasn't pursuing a path of living morality in the governing of the state. And this was difficult for Confucius because he realizes that continuing to work with this ruler, he will have to compromise his own moral character, which wasn't an option for him. And this is where Confucius decides to teach and travel throughout China in order to teach people how to become ethical individuals or philosophers. So what is quite interesting about Confucius and his thought is his vision brings together the collective and individual into one. And what he says is that ultimately there is no disconnect between one and many, because we are all interconnected and responsible for each other. Therefore, the happiness of one is happiness of many, and happiness of many is happiness of one. This is not something we cultivate today. We live rather in competition with others or also quite often in opposition to others. But what Confucius states here is that the virtue, he called it ren, or the moral strength, if that's the word that relates easier to us, and li, or social order, are intimately related. So if we understand this in practice, we see the importance of generosity and expanding our horizons to embrace the macrocosm around us, instead of only being focused on that which is immediately mine. And so this sentiment of responsibility, of loyalty and respect might be unpopular today, but these sentiments allow us to give ourselves and discover a new inner potential we didn't think we have. In truth, without cultivating this attitude of responsibility and collectivity, we cannot really progress as individuals, because we cannot bring to life that inner potential of our being that is unselfish, generous, and just. There is one occasion where Confucius himself was asked how to best serve the gods, to which he responded that best is to first concern ourselves with serving others, the people around us, and then dedicate ourselves to serving the gods. And so he was a man of here and now, and he saw the importance of practicing the virtues now with others and with ourselves. And what he had as well, at the same time, he had a tremendous trust in others and in their soul. You may be wondering as well, in what times, what was the context of the time when Confucius lived? Because Confucius was a product of his time, in reality. And this is something that we see quite often throughout the history, that philosophy is born in conflicting times, where there is a need for us to think for ourselves and liberate ourselves from the manipulation and conditioning of the time. And China was in the same context. So what we see during that period is that the central government lost its power and control, and China ends up being a collection of warring states fighting for power. And this dangerous and challenging dynamic of the time stood in contrast with other historical times in China that were so-called golden ages, where China and different states of China lived in periods of peace and prosperity. And so what Confucius observes during these periods, because he knew the history of China well, is that they were able to overcome personal differences in order to create a united and peaceful collective. And what he recognizes as well, that during this period of time, the country was really led by benevolent rulers of Yao and Shun, or wise kings Wen and Wu, who later even became nearly mythical figures in the history of the country. And so what he took away from that without an ethical individual, we cannot have times of peace and prosperity. So therefore, Confucius dedicates himself on education of a philosopher. And he travels throughout the country to teach all those who have a deep desire to change and transform, and to find a way to ennoble the individual and collective there where political systems have failed. Through an ethical education of the individual, what we can inspire is the inner change, and therefore a change in the collective. He was often mocked for this attitude, that he's a man who knows he cannot succeed and keeps trying. But the outcome didn't take away his confidence, that was limitless, that his work was very important. And so basically, his personal choice was not determined by a short-term result, but by a need to do what is right according to his consciousness. Whether it is recognized and accepted by others, it's a different story. So what Confucius, in a way, leaves us, he will give us, or we can take away, so to say, three fundamental keys on how to act in the world with integrity and authenticity, being a protagonist of a positive change in the society. And I would like to take a little bit of time to go through this. And I hope that you can still follow, that I'm not too fast. So the first key is to become the best we can be. It is this concept of Junzi, of a noble individual who is clear about one's own identity and knows how to be authentic. Well, what this means is to be oneself. And to be oneself implies to be in contact with our own inner self, and that there is a deep need to develop a moral behavior. It is to know ourselves and to be present with the best of our being, which provokes a state of serenity that is independent of external conditions. If we are to become the best we can be, we cannot be afraid to engage in the battle within ourselves, because without consciously facing our fears, our selfishness, our separateness, our fragmented vision and our pettiness, we cannot bring light to the light the deep potential of our inner being, or a deep potential of our virtue or moral character. And so how do we overcome ignorance and weakness? Well, by mobilizing our will to qualify ourselves every day, patiently and with perseverance, to practice ourselves in virtue, in being virtuous. And so this will naturally bring up a fundamental friction in ourselves. Between what? Well, between who we are now and who we wish to become. Because there is a distance to go, hopefully, between who we are now and who we want to truly become. There is one quote from Confucius that is quite interesting, when he says, when you meet a worthy person, think how you could become his equal. When you meet an unworthy person, turn inward and examine your conduct. And so what he says, in different words, that in each situation there is a point of learning. If we open our mind and our heart to the possibility that we are not complete yet. But with this perseverance to perfect ourselves without losing ourselves in being perfect. And I'm going to add to this, without losing our confidence in who we are. So to say, this philosophical perspective brings us to examine how we relate and see the world, because what it says in reality, that all the challenges that we are facing externally, challenges that we may find with another person, have to some degree, or sometimes all to the full extent, a reflection. They reflect our inner difficulties. Because the life we cannot change, the circumstances that are in front of us we cannot erase, but our inner attitude and how we relate to these challenges of time depends on us. And so therefore, the best is to start with bettering ourselves. And so in New Acropolis, what we propose is this approach to philosophy as a way of life, because the practice of virtue, of building our moral character, is the best medicine against unhappiness and lack of meaning. And all traditions teach us that there is no really a magic wand, like in Harry Potter, that will give us answers to our questions and who we are. But it requires of us an effort that we patiently, step by step, build ourselves, our moral character, like alchemist who transforms iron into gold. And this is also what Confucius brings to us back. And on one occasion, he says, who can leave a room without using a door? How it is then that no one uses this way when conducting life? And that's very interesting. That's, you know, in everything else that we do, in acquiring our professional skills, we accept the method of educating ourselves. But when it comes to becoming oneself, we think that this should come without an effort. Well, by reducing our comfort zone, we become capable of building our inner change. And that's important. The path of our evolutions exists only when we set out with our own decision. And the key to our destiny is always within us. And that's something that's a sentiment, a thought, an ideal that within each one of us hides a tremendous potential of the inner being that we can at any point in time activate if we choose so. To give you a little bit a more practical idea, you know how this can be applied, Confucius has recommended that there are 9 points that a Junzi should or must always consider. Okay, so he didn't leave any ambiguity there. So if we are to build ourselves and awaken our inner potential, there are certain things that we need to learn to practice. And I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm sure you can find it online, but there's some that are quite interesting. So the one of these guidelines or points is when observing to see clearly. That means to see things for what they are, ourselves, without judging, without wishful thinking, or layering of our emotions. As you can imagine, it requires a certain level of self-mastery and mastering our mind. When listen distinctly, to be present in the conversation with another person, and again, with the same, without judgment, and always with an effort to understand. When we are angry, before we act, it is to ponder the consequences, so that we don't act impulsively. Mm-hmm. And when we are gaining advantage, to consider if it's fair. Because if it's not fair, we should not do it. Okay. So this is, in this first key, you can see that we are exercising ourselves in becoming the best we can be. And this is the ideal of philosophy, and therefore, this is something that we pursue as a school of philosophy too. But there are 2 other keys that are intimately related, and it gives us a different dimension of how to act in the world. And the second key is to be a citizen responsible for others. For Confucius, a wise human being, a Junzi, is the one who recognizes his own position, his or her, apologies if I'm not using both, within each group and meets the responsibility that comes with it. Yeah. So one of the key qualities that Confucius said, or the most essential inner qualities that we need to learn, for Confucius, it was so-called shu, which meant consideration or caring for others. So it is this practice of what he calls humanness, commitment to others, that allows us to provoke an inner change. Now, to give you an example of importance of this, we can definitely take a look and around in the situation of COVID and this pandemic, because what became very apparent, and not anymore intellectual, is that our actions have immediate impact on others. Although apparently we don't have immediate connection with these other people. And so our challenge today that we are facing is to protect others and ourselves, to be considerate of others, which means that we need to learn to set aside our personal preferences and above all desires to return to what we know. Okay. And as you can imagine, this implies a self-mastery, so we can act from the best within. Because what Confucius explained, a political order, so order in the collectivity, is the product of an ethical order, which is order in the individual. So for him, there is no distinction. We are always a part of collectivity. And so this order is related to harmony, to an ideal, which is visible in the nature, in a natural system, in a timeless wisdom. But through a philosophical education, what we want to learn is how to make this order a part of our own lives. That is to say, how to create a discipline of living that awakens humanness, so to say. And so furthermore, he explains a little bit this relationship with others, and he says, to govern is to correct. When you set an example by correcting your mistakes, who will dare not to correct his mistakes? And here we have this sense of responsibility that enables us to modify the impulse and guide our actions by our virtues. And this is this when we say to lead by an example. And our primary duty, so we could say, is that it's the one towards our own consciousness and towards others. Now, we have a difficulty a little bit to understand today, perhaps a little the commitment, the value of commitment and responsibility. And so where we find ourselves often is that there is a certain avoidance of committing to anything, really. We are afraid of missing out. Our decisions are sometimes indecisive. But this attitude towards life creates suffering and frustration of not really knowing what we should do, and above all, why. Because we don't have to, in reality, commit to everything, only to that which is aligned to our own consciousness. And Confucius explained that a Junzi, when he or she names something, the name can surely hold up in speech. Okay, so it has a value. When he or she says something, his word can surely be carried out in action. And when a gentleman speaks, there is nothing casual or careless about what he says. In different words, a person who has a thorough understanding of the correct way to relate to others will find no obstacle to his actions. Now, through practice of these two first principles, it will progressively lead us to the third, so to say, key of action, which will lead us to experience unity with others and nature. And this is where we find the concept of what Confucius calls ritual propriety. So this was something very important to all great philosophers of antiquity. And what is meant by propriety? Let us take a look at the definition in the dictionary. What it means is to behave as if someone owns something or someone. Okay. But philosophically, what this means is to own our own actions, or in other words, to be a master of oneself, Junzi or individual. What it means for us that every action can become meaningful, because as he said before, is when Junzi speaks, there is nothing casual or careless about what he says. It is not to be rigid, but it is rather to discover the art of being present in our actions, so we know how to be in every situation. There is an expression of it, we can say it's a courtesy. So what in antiquity and Confucius is not different. They explain that the practice of ethics brought a philosopher, a disciple, a practitioner to unity with the laws of life, others, and ourselves. And so what it meant to be ethical is to be able to produce unity and therefore reenact the natural order. And so to unite with nature, it also means to unite with our human nature. And if you can unite with your inner nature, you can unite with nature as a whole. There is one conversation that is quite poignant of this, and it is between Confucius, disciples of Confucius. And one of them is saying, or complaining, so to say, all men have brothers, I alone have none. And another one says, well, I heard it said that life and death are a matter of destiny, meaning they are outside of our control. Wealth and honor, the same, rests with heaven. But Junzi is respectful and free of errors. He is courteous towards others and conducts himself with ritual propriety. All men, pithing the four seas, are his brothers. Why should he be worried about not having brothers? So what he brings us a little bit more is to expand our consciousness to embrace a larger collective, to overcome a pitfall of thinking in two columns, which happens to us often unconsciously, that there are those who belong with me and those that are against me, that there is that which is correct and incorrect, and often that which is incorrect is that which is in contrast to what we think is right. And so progressively to look, so this attitude of discovering the unities pushes us to progressively look beyond differences to discover the unity that is behind that is essential. And we find that when we go towards that which is right. And Confucius explains that the gentleman, a Junzi, in his or her dealings with the world, is not predisposed to what he or she is for or against. He or she only sides with that which is right. Okay. So we are coming slowly to the end of the lecture. Thank you very much for your attention. The one thing that to just conclude is that in Confucius, and I hope that this inspired a little bit of curiosity to discover more and interest, we find an example of a human being who learned to overcome his own limitations by a practice of humanness. A philosopher, a master of wisdom, who taught us how to embark on a path of inner transformation and collective change. What is remarkable about Confucius is that he always said that he had a great trust that every human being can do the same. So on one occasion he said, is it possible for a person in a space of a day to devote all his efforts to practice of humanness? I have never seen a person who lacks the strength to do so. There may be one, but I have never seen such a person. So basically, he had a deep trust that each single of us can become a philosopher, if we choose to do so. So while we are finishing this public talk, this online talk, I would also like to invite everybody who are interested in discovering more about becoming a philosopher and how we can face the challenges of time with trust and integrity, to join us and to start with us the course in philosophy of living, which in Bray, in our center, is starting online, but then hopefully we're going to be at a stage where we can continue the class in the center itself next Wednesday on July 22nd at 7:30. And please feel free to reach out or to book a place via Eventbrite. But what we are going to be focusing is, we are already seeing our approach to philosophy, where we seek to discover a method of knowing ourselves and art and science of living in solidarity and fraternity, and learning how to engage with the mystery of life with confidence and courage. And so the whole course is going to be focused on a practical approach that encourages philosophy of living and for today, that help us to overcome our indifference and fears in a challenging time.